You look at the title and think you know what it means. The winter of 1879, when schools never opened. It sounds simple. It sounds like a line from a quiet chapter in an old book. But you hold more in common with those children than you expect. You know the feeling of waiting for something that never comes. You know the weight of silence when days stretch longer than they should. Picture a whole town frozen in that feeling. Picture streets with no morning rush. Picture teachers who stand at their doors with ink frozen in the wells. Picture parents who whisper to their children near cold stoves because schoolhouse fires stay dark. You step into that winter now. It reaches for you in a soft way, slow, still. Close. This story follows a woman named Clara Brigham. She lived on the north side of a small New England town in 1879. She taught reading and numbers to children who walked along the ridge each morning. She held folded letters from parents in her desk and kept extra mittens for those who forgot their own. When the deep freeze took hold, she moved through long nights with a slow pace, listening for cracks in the old boards of her rented room. Snow piled along the paths outside her door and turned hard as iron. Her schoolhouse stood locked under frost. No children passed by. The freeze shaped every step she took through that winter. Before we start, I want to thank you for being here. Tell me where you are watching from tonight and what the hour is for you. Settle your shoulders. Pull a blanket closer. Let your breath fall slow. Let your room grow quiet. If you enjoy these soft winter stories, tap like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so the next calm night finds you with ease. Clara woke before the first hint of blue touched the window. Her room sat still under the weight of the freeze. She lay on her side for a moment, listening to the quiet that pressed against the walls. The boards held no sound. The wind sat low. The stove beside her bed held nothing but last night's ash, cold as stone. She rubbed her hands together and rose with slow steps. Her breath lifted in a soft cloud in front of her lips. She crossed the room and struck the match with care. The flame rose in a faint line and met the kindling she had set aside the night before. The wood took the fire in slow sparks. She held her palms toward it and let the warmth push through her fingers. It was never enough to break the hold of the cold, but it gave her a steady start to the morning. Clara reached for her wool skirt and pressed it to her legs. The fabric felt stiff after a night against the chair. She tied her boots and pulled her shawl around her shoulders. The cloth held the smell of smoke from the last weeks of long nights. Every layer mattered during this winter. The freeze refused to lift. People spoke of it softly, as if fear might carry through the air if words were too loud. She opened her door and stepped into the hall of the boarding house. Frost traced the inside of the windows. The stairs creaked under her feet, though the sound felt muted by the cold. The dining room sat empty. The owner had stopped laying out bread and porridge each morning. Food had become scarce. Deliveries along the ridge stalled. Wagons froze along the east road. She took an apple from her satchel instead and bit into it. The fruit pressed against her teeth with a hard snap. When she stepped outside, the morning stood still. Snow reached the tops of the fences. The path toward the ridge formed a narrow trench through drifts that had hardened overnight. She moved through it with a slow pace. Her boots met the ground in careful steps. The cold settled into her shins and crawled upward. Her breath left her mouth in steady waves. The schoolhouse waited in the distance, small and square, set apart from the houses. It stood dark again. She walked toward it each morning out of habit, though she knew no children would appear. The freeze had locked the town in its grip for weeks. Parents kept their children home near stoves and lamps. Clara's work had fallen into silence, though she kept her routine. It felt wrong to let the schoolhouse sit without her steps. She reached the door and brushed off the layer of frost on the latch. The metal burned her fingertips. She placed her hand flat on the wood. The boards felt solid from the cold. She had locked it herself 10 days before. No reason to open it now. Ink froze in its wells. Slate boards held dust in stiff lines. Desks sat empty with books closed in the same place students had left them. Clara stayed there for a long moment. Snow shifted in thin curls along the edges of the building. A smell of pine drifted from the woods to the north. She watched the road in case a small shape appeared. A child, a parent, a messenger. No one came. The wind lifted in a slow breath across the ridge. She walked round the schoolhouse and checked the windows. Frost covered each pane with dense lines. She scraped a circle with her glove and looked inside. Her desk sat near the far wall. A stack of spellers waited there. On the shelf behind it sat the basket that held spare mittens she had sewn herself. She had taken pride in those small comforts. Now they waited without purpose. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded note. It came from a parent 2 days earlier. Ink shaky. Words short. Their daughter had fallen sick. No heat in their small cabin. They hoped the girl would recover. They asked Clara for prayers. Clara kept the note with her, reading it each morning at the schoolhouse door. She felt close to her students this way, even when she could not see them. She turned from the window and walked to Wartown. The cold pressed harder as the wind picked up. She drew her shawl closer. Her cheeks burned. Snow cracked under her feet. Smoke drifted from a few chimneys in weak lines. Most homes used wood sparingly now. Some had none left. People took turns sitting near small fires, resting their hands close enough to warm skin, but not close enough to lose fuel. Clara passed the general store. The door stayed shut. A sign in the window read, "No new stock. Try next week." She doubted next week would bring anything. The roads out of town had turned to sheets of ice. Horses slipped. Wagons toppled. Drivers gave up under the weight of failed attempts. Supplies sat frozen miles away. She stepped toward the chapel. Its windows stayed dark. The minister had fallen ill the week before. His wife tended to him round the clock. Clara had brought them broth 3 times. She planned to go again today. She knew their home would hold cold air and weak light. She passed the baker's house. No bread came from his oven since the freeze began. He kept his family inside with blankets over the window frames. The freeze pressed through the cracks. Clara thought of the children inside, their fingers stiff as they held slates or small toys. She thought of the way silence wrapped around households when days stretched like this. When she reached the minister's home, she knocked softly. The door opened to a dim room. His wife greeted her with tired eyes. She held a cup of tea cupped in both hands. Lines formed around her mouth from cold and worry. Clara handed her a small jar. Dried herbs. She ground them last night to help with his fever. The woman thanked her and led her to the small bedroom. The minister rested under blankets quilted in faded colors. Clara placed her hand on his shoulder, warm but weak. She spoke his name with care. His breath stirred, slow but steady. She stayed for an hour. She helped with small tasks. She warmed broth on the stove. She swept the frost that had fallen from the doorframe. She helped mend a tear in one of the blankets. When she stepped back outside, the sun reached higher in the sky. It brought light, but no warmth. Clara walked toward the ridge again. She wanted to check on two of her students who lived near the edge of town. The brother and sister had walked together each morning before the freeze. They always arrived early. They always sat in the front row. She remembered their quiet smiles. She remembered how they whispered to one another before lessons started. Their cabins sat beside a half-frozen stream. She reached the small porch and knocked. The mother opened the door with a slow motion. Her shoulders slumped. She greeted Clara with a thin smile. Inside, the children sat wrapped in blankets near a tin stove with a small flame. Their faces brightened when they saw her. She knelt beside them and asked how they felt. They spoke of boredom. Long days indoors, short daylight. They missed their friends. They missed lessons. Clara pulled 2 small books from her satchel and handed them over. She had found them tucked in a desk drawer at the schoolhouse. Simple readers, illustrated. The children took them with gentle care. She stayed with them for a while. She listened to the mother speak of sleepless nights and shrinking stores of food. Clara offered help. She would bring wood tomorrow. She would bring broth. She would stay longer if needed. When she stepped back outside, the sky held a muted grey. Snow drifted from the ridge in thin lines. Clara walked slowly toward town. The cold reached through every layer of her clothing. Her breath came out in tired clouds. Her cheeks stung, yet she kept walking. The routine gave her purpose. The schoolhouse waited. The children waited. The town waited under the freeze. She would keep her steps steady each day. Clara woke earlier the next morning. The air inside her room felt heavier than the day before. Frost lined the corner near the window in thicker layers. She sat up and pressed her hands together for warmth. The floor met her feet with a sharp sting as she swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She lit the stove with slow care. The wood inside sputtered at first, then caught with a faint orange glow. The heat spread through the room in thin threads. She dressed in the same heavy skirt and shawl. The cloth held little warmth now. Every layer felt tired. She wrapped a scarf around her neck and tucked the ends into her coat. She picked up the basket she filled last night with broth, 2 pieces of bread, and herbs from her small store. She planned to start the day with the minister's family again. They needed steadier support as his fever shifted through each night. Outside, the air hit her with sharp force. Her breath pushed forward and drifted into the morning in slow clouds. Snow layers had hardened during the night. The path down the street shone with a thin crust of ice. She stepped with care, placing her boots flat with each pace. The sky held a still grey light. The town woke in slow movements. No footsteps reached her ears. No sound came from doors or windows. Winter pressed against every wall. She passed the general store again. The sign still hung in the window, frozen in place. No new stock. Try next week. She had read it so many times, the letters lived in her mind. She wondered how long the owner would keep hope alive. She wondered how long the town would hold on with shrinking stores. She reached the minister's home and knocked. His wife opened the door with relief. She held her shawl tight around her shoulders. Her eyes carried deep shadows from long hours without rest. Clara stepped inside. The heat felt faint but present. She set her basket on the table and uncovered the broth. The scent filled the small room. The minister lay under his blankets. His skin held less color today. His breath came in shallow waves. Clara sat beside him and spoke his name in a soft voice. His eyelids lifted a little. She took his hand and held it between her palms. His wife stood behind her with folded hands. She whispered about the long night. His fever rose and fell. He spoke in quiet sounds that held no clear words. She feared each hour Clara stayed through the morning. She warmed broth and fed him small spoonfuls. She helped stoke the stove. She washed the cloths used to cool his forehead. She spoke with his wife about the freeze. Each day that passed with cold like this strained every house in town. Supplies thinned. Wood stacks shrank. Illness crept through cabins. People whispered about the freeze as if it held its own will. When his breathing settled into a steady rhythm, Clara rose. She promised to return in the afternoon. She stepped outside and felt the cold settle once more against her skin. The wind reached through the streets in soft lines. Snow lifted and drifted across her boots. She headed toward the ridge where the children lived. Her promise from the day before weighed on her mind. She carried a separate bundle of wood tied with rope. The pieces clacked against her leg with each step. She walked with slow resolve through the drifts. The edges of town held fewer houses. The trees grew taller. Snow pressed against their trunks and formed deep mounds around their roots. When she reached the cabin, she knocked with the back of her glove. The door opened with care. The mother greeted her with gratitude in her eyes. Clara stepped inside and set the wood beside the stove. The children sat near the flame, reading the books she brought yesterday. Their faces brightened when they saw her. They showed her the pages they liked most. She knelt next to them and listened to their voices. She felt a loose warmth soak through her as they told her each small detail. The cabin held more heat today. The wood stack had thinned. The mother worried it would not last long. Clara promised more in the days ahead. She knew her own supply ran low, but she would find ways. She always found ways when her students needed warmth. She stayed until midday. She looked through the window and saw the sky lighten. Snow fell in scattered flakes. The mother walked her to the door and thanked her again. Clara stepped out into the quiet and pulled her shawl tighter. She made her way back toward town. Halfway down the road, she stopped at the stream. The surface held a thin sheet of ice. Water moved beneath it in slow rhythms. She knelt by the edge and touched the frozen layer with her glove. It cracked under the pressure. Winter pressed deeper each day. The freeze felt endless. She rose and walked to the schoolhouse. She felt drawn to it even when no students came. She brushed frost from the latch and pressed her palm against the door. The boards still felt solid with cold. She knew the interior would hold air so cold. Her breath would hang in the room like a thin mist. She walked round to the side, window again, and scraped a circle through the frost. The same stillness greeted her. Her desk waited near the wall. The mittens sat in their basket. The spellers waited on each desk. She pictured her students sitting there with flushed cheeks from the cold, their breaths rising as they listened to her lessons. She missed their presence. She missed the soft rustling sounds of their work. She stood there longer than usual. Snow fell in slow lines around her. The wind shifted and settled again. She felt the weight of the freeze press against her chest. She wondered how long it would hold the town in its grip. She wondered if spring would ever return. She lowered her hand from the glass and turned toward the road. She walked slowly back to town. The afternoon passed in muted silence. She visited a few neighbors. She carried water from wells. She helped bring wood inside. Each home held its own struggle. She felt the strain in each doorway. She offered calm words and steady hands. When the sun started to drop, she returned to her room at the boarding house. She lit the stove again and warmed a small pot of broth for herself. She sat on her chair near the window and listened to the stillness outside. Snow drifted from the eaves. The street held no footprints. The silence wrapped around the town with deep strength. Clara folded her hands in her lap. She breathed in slow rhythm. She thought of the minister, the children, the families. She thought of the schoolhouse, waiting in the cold. She felt the long winter stretch ahead. Then she stood and set her pot aside. She reached for her shawl and placed it over her shoulders. The night grew cold again, but she held her resolve. She would continue each day with steady steps. She would hold her place in this winter, no matter how long the freeze lasted. Clara woke before dawn again. The cold settled deeper than the day before. Her room felt hollow. The air did not move. Frost stretched along the baseboard in a thin ridge. She sat up and pressed her hands to her cheeks. Her breath drifted upward in pale curls. She reached for a match and lit the stove with slow care. The flame rose in a faint line and settled into the kindling. She held her palms near it and waited for the heat to reach her skin. She dressed with steady movements. Shawl, scarf, skirt, coat. Each layer felt stiff. She stepped into her boots and tightened the laces. The floor groaned under her as she crossed the room. She picked up the 2 jars she filled last night. Broth in one, dried herbs in the other. She placed them in her satchel and stepped into the hall. The boarding house sat quiet. Doors stayed shut. No voices drifted through the rooms. Clara walked down the stairs and opened the front door. The cold hit her with force. She pulled her scarf higher over her chin. Snow drifted from the eaves above her in thin sheets. She stepped into the street. Her boots sank into a shallow layer of fresh snow. The morning sky held a faint blue under thick clouds. A few lamps burned in windows across the street. The rest of the town stayed dark. She moved toward the minister's home. Each step sounded heavy in the frozen air. When she reached the door, she knocked with her knuckles. The minister's wife opened it with tired hands. Her eyes held worry and fatigue. Her shawl hung low around her shoulders. Clara stepped inside. The room held weak heat. She set her satchel on the table and uncovered the jars. She filled a small pot with broth and placed it on the stove. The minister rested under his blankets, his breath thin and uneven. Clara sat beside him and placed her hand on his arm. His skin felt warm but strained. His wife spoke about the night. He had spoken in short, unclear sounds. He woke twice with confusion. His fever rose at dawn. She had stayed awake through each moment. Clara listened with calm attention. She took a cloth from a basin of cold water and placed it on his forehead. She stayed through the morning. She fed him a few sips at a time. She helped sweep frost near the window where the cold pressed through the cracks. She asked his wife to rest for a short while. The woman sat by the stove and closed her eyes. Clara listened to her faint breaths as she slept in an upright position. When the minister settled into quiet rest, Clara stood. She placed her shawl over her shoulders and stepped outside. The road felt colder than earlier. The wind rose from the ridge. Snow blew across her boots in long lines. She held her satchel close and walked toward the stream. She planned to visit the children again. Their cabin needed more wood. She held 3 pieces under her arm. Her muscles ached under the weight. As she reached the path near the stream, she noticed 2 figures walking toward town. They moved with stiff steps. Their coats looked thin. As they neared, she recognized them. A father and his young son who lived farther east. She had not seen them since the start of the freeze. The boy's cheeks held a deep red from the cold. The father carried a sack that sagged in his hand. Clara greeted them. The father spoke with a strained voice. Their well had frozen. Their stove had burned through the last of their dry wood. They had come to town for help. Clara listened and pointed them toward the boarding house where she knew an empty room held blankets. She promised to bring them food later. The father nodded with slow gratitude. They continued down the road with weak steps. Clara turned back toward the ridge. When she reached the children's cabin, she knocked. The door opened in a small crack. The mother smiled when she saw the wood in Clara's arms. She stepped aside and let her in. The children sat near the stove again. Their books rested on their laps. Their smiles lifted the room. Clara placed the wood near the stove. She checked the flame. It burned low. The mother added a small piece. The heat rose with a steady glow. Clara knelt by the children. They showed her new pages they read that morning. Their voices held warmth. She listened and asked questions. She felt steady comfort when she looked at them. The mother spoke about the night. A thin crack had formed in one of the windows, and the cold pressed through it. They covered it with cloth to keep the frost from spreading. Clara examined the cloth and promised to bring nails and a board tomorrow. She stayed with them until midday. When she stepped outside again, snow fell in slow flakes. The wind settled for a moment. The sky opened with a pale hint of sunlight. Clara walked down the ridge with quiet steps. Her breath warmed the air in steady clouds. She passed the schoolhouse again. Something drew her to it each day. She brushed snow from the window and looked inside. The desks sat where she had left them. Books waited. Mittens rested in their basket. Her heart tightened with each glance. She missed the small sounds of children settling into seats. She missed their eyes following her as she taught each lesson. She rested her hand on the wood and held it there. She continued toward town. As she neared the square, she saw figures gathered near the general store. She walked toward them with concern. A wagon had arrived from the south. The wheels sat frozen in slush. The driver leaned against the seat with weary eyes. He had pushed through the roads with great effort. People gathered to see what he brought. The owner of the store stepped outside and spoke with him. Clara watched from the edge of the crowd. The wagon held a small crate of flour, a few sacks of potatoes, and 2 bundles of wool. The town needed far more, but even this felt like a blessing. People stepped forward in slow lines. They spoke with quiet voices. They took only what they needed. Clara stepped back and let others claim supplies first. She knew her students needed food more than she did. She would collect what remained later. She turned and walked toward the boarding house. She entered through the back door and went to her room. The heat from her stove had faded. She lit it again and sat near it. She rested her hands in her lap and thought of the father and son she met that morning. She gathered bread, broth, and a small blanket from her shelf. She stepped back outside and walked to the room where they stayed. She knocked softly. The father opened the door with tired gratitude. She handed him the supplies and wished them warmth for the night. When she returned to her room, the sky outside had darkened. Snow fell in steady lines. The street held no footsteps. Windows shone with faint light. The town sat under deep silence. Clara sat in her chair near the window. She watched the drift of snow. She listened to the stillness. She felt the weight of winter settle again, but she held her resolve with strength. She knew morning would bring more work, more small steps, more chances to help the people around her. She rested her head against the back of the chair and closed her eyes for a moment. Her breath slowed. Her hands loosened. She gathered her strength for the next day. Clara woke to a harsher cold than the mornings before. The air pressed against her skin with sharp weight. Frost traced new lines along the window. She rose with slow movement, her joints tight from the night. She reached for the matchbox on the small table near her bed and struck a match. The stove answered with a weak flicker that grew into a steady flame. She held her hands near it and waited until the heat touched her fingers. She dressed in her thick skirt and wool shawl. The cloth felt stiff with the cold. She wrapped her scarf around her neck and tucked the ends inside her coat. Her boots felt heavy as she stepped into them. Each motion took effort. She lifted her satchel and placed herbs, cloths, and a small jar of broth inside. She planned to visit the minister first, as she did each morning. She stepped into the hall. The boards creaked under her feet. The boarding house stayed silent. She reached the door and pulled it open. The cold hit her like a wave. Her breath drifted in front of her in slow clouds. She closed the door behind her and stepped into the street. The town sat under a thick layer of snow. No new footprints marked the ground. Chimneys released faint trails of smoke. Doors stayed shut. Lamps burned behind frosted windows. Clara walked toward the minister's home. Her breath formed steady plumes as she moved down the empty road. When she reached the small house, she knocked. The door opened slowly. The minister's wife stood inside with tired eyes. Her shawl hung low around her shoulders. Clara stepped inside and removed her gloves. The room held weak heat, but it felt warmer than the street. The minister lay under several blankets. His skin looked pale. His breath came in shallow waves. Clara knelt beside him and placed her hand on his arm. His skin felt warm, yet fragile. She looked at his wife with quiet concern. The woman lowered her eyes and spoke of another restless night. His fever rose at dusk. He drifted in and out of wakefulness. He murmured names she did not know. Clara took the jar of broth from her satchel and warmed it on the stove. She sat beside the minister and fed him a few small spoonfuls. He swallowed with slow effort. She dabbed his forehead with a wet cloth. She changed the blanket near his feet. She listened to his breath shift between soft and strained rhythms. His wife moved about the room in slow steps. She washed a cup. She straightened a chair. She folded a blanket with shaking hands. Clara watched her with quiet worry. The woman had slept little for days. Clara asked her to rest for a short while. She guided her to a chair near the stove. The woman closed her eyes but did not sleep. She drifted somewhere between exhaustion and fear. Clara stayed until the minister slipped into a deeper rest. She stood and placed her shawl back around her shoulders. She promised to return in the afternoon. She stepped outside into the cold and pulled the door shut behind her. The sky held a dull grey. Snow drifted from the ridge in thin lines. Clara walked toward the small bridge near the stream. She planned to visit the children again. Their cabin always needed support. She carried a small tinned lamp in her satchel in case they needed extra light for the evening. As she followed the path along the stream, she noticed how the ice had thickened since yesterday. A sheet of white stretched across most of its surface. Only a thin line of water moved beneath a narrow break near the far bank. She listened to the soft crackle of ice shifting under pressure. The sound echoed through the still morning. She continued toward the cabin. When she reached the door, she knocked. The mother opened it with a small smile. Clara stepped inside. Warmth from the stove touched her face. The children sat near the flame with their books open on their laps. They looked up with bright eyes and hurried to show her the pages they had read that morning. Clara knelt beside them and listened. Their voices carried soft excitement. They told her about the stories they found. She pointed at words and asked them questions. They answered with eagerness. She felt warmth spread through her chest as she sat with them. The mother spoke about the night. The wind pressed against the walls. The cloth they hung over the cracked window held, though frost still gathered along the edges. They had used most of their wood. Clara nodded and promised to bring more tomorrow. She placed the tinned lamp on the table and told the mother it would help during the long evenings. She stayed until midday. When she stepped outside again, snowflakes drifted in slow circles. The wind stayed low. The quiet felt thick. Clara walked toward the schoolhouse. She felt pulled to it. Each day brought the same ache when she looked at the locked door. She brushed the frost from the window and peered inside. The room sat still. Her desk, her slate, the bookshelf, the mittens she had made, the spellers arranged in neat stacks. Her students' desks waited in a perfect row. Books lay closed. Ink bottles froze in their wells. She touched the glass with her glove. The cold pressed through the fabric. She pictured the children running toward the door in the morning, their cheeks bright, their voices lifting the air. She pictured their laughter as they filled the room with life. Now the silence felt sharp. She stepped back and continued her path toward town. When she approached the square, she saw people gathered again. The same wagon from yesterday remained stuck in the frozen slush. The driver worked to free one of the wheels. The store owner stood beside him, offering short instructions. Clara noticed a group of families waiting for supplies. She stepped forward with steady calm. She approached the store owner and asked about the remaining goods. He opened the crate and handed her a small sack of potatoes and half a bundle of wool. She thanked him and placed the items in her satchel. She planned to share them with the father and son she met yesterday. She left the square and walked toward the boarding house. The father and boy waited near the back steps, sitting close to each other with their blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Their breath formed white clouds. Their faces showed relief when they saw Clara. She handed them the potatoes and the wool. The father lowered his eyes with gratitude. Clara helped the boy wrap the wool around his shoulders. His small hands clutched the edges. She spoke to them with calm warmth and told them she would bring more when the next wagon arrived. She returned to her room. The stove still burned from the morning. She warmed her hands near it and sat for a moment. The sound of snow falling outside filled the quiet. She watched flakes drift past her window. They moved with soft weight, settling on the sill in a thin layer. After a few minutes of rest, she stood and filled her satchel again. She planned to visit a family who lived near the far edge of town. Their home sat near the woods. The father had injured his leg 2 days ago. The mother cared for their 2 young children while tending the stove alone. Clara knew they needed support. She stepped outside and walked through the narrow path carved by footsteps from earlier weeks. Snow reached above her ankles. The woods stood ahead in tall, dark shapes. The path wound between them. The air inside the trees felt colder. Less light reached the ground. Snow weighed down the branches. When she reached the cabin, she knocked. The mother opened the door and greeted her with tired relief. The children sat near the stove with small blankets around their shoulders. The father rested on a cot against the far wall. His leg remained wrapped in cloth. He nodded at Clara with a faint smile. Clara set the items from her satchel on the table. She helped the mother prepare a small pot of broth. She checked the father's leg and adjusted the cloth around it. She helped gather wood from the small stack near the door and placed it near the stove. The mother spoke of their struggles. The children grew restless with each passing day indoors. The father worried he would not walk for weeks. Their supplies dwindled faster than expected. Clara listened with calm attention. She offered words of comfort and stayed with them until the stove warmed the room. As she left the cabin, the sky darkened. Snow fell heavier. She stepped onto the path and pulled her shawl closer. The cold settled into her arms. The wind rose between the trees in slow, sweeping breaths. She made her way back to town. The evening lamps began to glow behind frosted windows. The streets stayed empty. The town lay under the weight of winter. Clara reached the boarding house and stepped inside. Her room felt cold but welcoming. She lit the stove with her last piece of kindling for the night. She sat on the chair near the window and watched the snow. Her breath slowed. Her shoulders loosened. She thought of the minister, the children, the families along the ridge. She thought of the schoolhouse waiting in silence. She took a deep breath and let it settle in her chest. Tomorrow would bring the same cold, the same weight, the same steady steps. She felt ready. Clara woke before dawn. The room held a deep cold. Her breath drifted in front of her in slow clouds. She wrapped her shawl round her shoulders before she stepped toward the stove. The fire from the night had gone out. Only a thin grey layer of ash remained. She struck a match and lit the kindling she set aside the evening before. The flame rose with a weak glow, then steadied. She warmed her hands and watched the small fire grow stronger. She dressed in layers and tied her boots. She reached for her satchel and placed inside a small bundle of herbs, a loaf of hard bread, and a handful of dried berries. She planned to visit the minister again. She hoped he gained strength during the night. When she stepped outside, the sky still held its early darkness. A pale blue stretched across the edge of the horizon. Snow covered the streets in a thick sheet. No tracks cut through it. The stillness felt heavier than usual. Even the air seemed to hold back sound. Clara moved down the street with slow steps. Her boots sank into the snow with each stride. Her breath rose in steady clouds. When she reached the minister's home, the window glowed with a faint light. She knocked. The minister's wife opened the door. Her face looked worn, but she gave Clara a soft smile. Clara stepped inside. The stove in the corner burned with low heat. The minister rested under blankets. His chest rose with slow, even breaths. Clara sat beside him and held his wrist for a moment. His pulse felt weak yet steady. She released a small sigh of relief. His wife whispered about the night. He slept for long hours. His fever lowered before dawn. He spoke a few words after waking, though his voice broke. Clara offered her gentle comfort and warmed broth on the stove. She fed him small spoonfuls. He swallowed with more ease than the day before. Clara stayed until he drifted back into rest. She stood and wrapped her shawl around her again. She told his wife she would return in the afternoon. The woman nodded with quiet hope. Clara stepped outside. Snow fell in slow flakes. The morning light grew stronger. She walked toward the ridge path that led to the children's cabin. She planned to bring them another bundle of reading pages she copied in her room the night before. The children waited for her lessons each day, their faces bright with excitement. When she reached their door, she knocked. The mother opened it with a warm smile. The children hurried toward Clara with eager eyes. They held out the book pages she brought them 2 days ago. They told her they read the stories again during the long hours before bed. Clara knelt beside them and handed them the new pages. They gathered around her with quick steps. She pointed to the lines and asked them to read the first few sentences. Their voices filled the room. The sound softened the cold that pressed against the walls. The mother thanked Clara for the tinned lamp from yesterday. She said the warm glow filled the room when the sky darkened. She said it brought comfort to the children. Clara felt a quiet warmth at the thought. She stayed until the fire in the stove burned low. She helped the mother gather wood, then stepped outside. Snow fell in thicker lines. The air grew heavier. She felt the frost cling to her scarf. She walked toward the schoolhouse. When she reached it, she stood before the door for a long moment. Frost covered the frame. She brushed some away with her glove and peered inside through the small glass pane. The room stayed quiet and still. A thin layer of frost spread across the tops of the desks. The blackboard held faint chalk lines from the last lesson she taught. The words looked ghostly in the cold. She touched the glass. The cold pressed through her glove. She longed to hear the children's voices inside. She longed to step through the doorway and welcome them in. She longed for a morning where the stove crackled, the ink warmed, and the desks filled with eager hands. She stepped back and lowered her head. The silence weighed on her. She knew she had to remain steady. Winter would end in time. The children would return. She held on to that thought like a small ember dot. As she turned to leave, she saw a figure approaching from the far end of the street. It was Mr. Norrin, the store owner. He carried a bundle under his arm. When he reached her, he paused to catch his breath. Snow clung to his coat. He told her another wagon arrived during the night. Supplies waited at the back of the store. She thanked him and walked with quick steps toward the square. People gathered again. Families waited in long lines. The wagon driver lifted crates from the back. Clara stepped forward. The store owner handed her a small bag of flour, a strip of dried meat, and a handful of wool scraps. She tucked everything into her satchel. She felt relief wash through her. These supplies would help many. She walked toward the boarding house where the father and boy waited most mornings. She found them sitting under the small awning near the steps. Snow fell steadily around them. They looked cold, their blankets wrapped tight. The boy stood when Clara approached. His eyes lit with hope. She handed them the flour and wool scraps. The father lowered his head with gratitude. Clara helped wrap the wool around their hands and shoulders for extra warmth. She spoke to them with calm assurance. She said she would bring more as soon as she could. She left them with a soft farewell and made her way toward the far woods again. The family near the forest edge needed fresh supplies. The father's injured leg forced the mother to tend to everything alone. Clara reached the path and walked through the dense trees. Snow weighed down the branches. The air felt colder inside the woods. She reached the cabin and knocked. The mother opened the door with relief. Clara stepped inside and placed the supplies on the table. The children gathered around with wide eyes. The father nodded from his cot. His leg remained wrapped. Clara checked the cloth for signs of infection. She spoke with calm reassurance. She told the mother to keep his leg warm and lift it when possible. She helped gather more wood from the shed. She stacked it inside near the stove. The mother thanked her with a tired yet grateful voice. The children followed Clara to the door when she left. They waved with small smiles. When she stepped outside, the wind picked up. Snow drifted sideways. The cold pressed against her coat. She wrapped her scarf tighter and walked back toward town. Her steps grew slower as the wind pushed against her. She lowered her head to shield her eyes from the flakes. As she reached the town's edge, she noticed the blacksmith's shop stood dark. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. She approached the door and knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Still no sound. She pushed the door and found it unlocked. She stepped inside. The air felt cold and hollow. The forge sat unlit. Tools lay scattered across the bench. She called out in a soft voice. After a moment, a faint sound answered from the back room. She followed it and found the blacksmith sitting on a stool with his head in his hands. His shoulders shook with quiet exhaustion. Clara approached him. His face looked pale. His hands trembled. He told her he felt weak since yesterday. He said he tried to work through it but could not stand for long. He feared the cold spread into his bones. Clara rested a hand on his shoulder and spoke in a calm tone. She lit the small stove in the corner and helped him sit near it. She took herbs from her satchel and steeped them in hot water. She handed him the cup and waited while he drank. She stayed until some color returned to his face. She stacked wood near the stove for him. She promised to return with broth later. She stepped outside and shut the door behind her. Snow fell harder. Evening approached, though the sky remained pale. She walked toward the boarding house with slow steps. The cold seeped into her arms. Her boots felt heavy. She reached her door and stepped inside. The room felt dark. She lit her small lamp and placed it on the table. The flame cast a soft glow. She removed her shawl and hung it near the stove. She rubbed her hands together. She lowered herself into the chair near the window and watched the falling snow. The sky darkened bit by bit. Lamps lit one by one in the houses around town. Their soft glow spread across the streets. Clara leaned back and let her breath slow. She thought of the minister resting in his small room. She thought of the children reading their pages near the warm stove. She thought of the families along the ridge. She thought of the blacksmith in his dim shop. She knew the cold pressed hard against every home. She knew each day brought the same struggle. She knew she had to remain steady. Winter moved at its own pace. She would match it step by step. Outside, the snow continued its slow drift. The night settled over the town with thick quiet. Clara woke in the night when the wind struck the side of the boarding house. The room shook with a low groan as the storm swept across the town. She rose to check the stove. The fire burned low. She added 2 small logs, watched the flame rise, and sat near it until the room warmed enough for comfort. When morning arrived, the storm still pressed against the windows. Heavy snow piled along the sill. Clara dressed in slow steps. She wrapped her shawl tight before stepping outside. The cold air rushed past her, sharp and strong. Snow drifted across the street in waves. The wind carried loose flakes through the air. The town felt buried under the long night. She walked toward the minister's home first. She moved with steady strides. Her boots sank deep into the snow. Each step took effort. When she reached the small house, she saw a soft glow through the window. She knocked with stiff fingers. The minister's wife opened the door with a look of relief. Inside, the air felt warmer. The stove burned with steady heat. The minister lay under blankets, his chest rising and falling with more strength than yesterday. Clara approached him and checked his pulse. His fever had lowered. His breath came easier. She smiled at his wife and asked how the night passed. The woman said he woke twice and spoke a few quiet words. She said he asked for water and even ate a small piece of the biscuit she set aside. Clara nodded with calm hope. She helped him drink broth and spoke to him in a low tone. He answered with faint words, though his eyes held more clarity than before. Clara stayed until he slept again. She packed her herbs and stood. The minister's wife held her hands in gratitude. Clara offered her a soft promise to return before dusk. She stepped outside. The wind struck her face with new force. Snow whipped across the street in long lines. She lowered her head and moved toward the ridge path. She aimed to reach the children's cabin before the storm worsened. When she reached the small house, she knocked, and the mother opened the door at once. The children rushed toward Clara with bright eyes. They held yesterday's pages and told her they read them during the storm. Their voices carried excitement that warmed the cold air inside the room. Clara sat with them and asked them to read aloud. Their voices rose in steady rhythm. The mother stood near the stove and watched them with quiet pride. Clara taught them new words and traced lines on fresh pages. The children leaned close and repeated each letter with care. She stayed until the wind struck the roof in strong bursts. She helped gather wood inside before she left. The mother thanked her again. The children waved from the doorway as Clara stepped outside. She turned toward town but noticed the smoke from the distant mill drifted weaker than usual. She feared the old couple who lived beside the mill struggled with the cold. She changed direction and moved toward their cabin. The path felt narrow under the deep snow. Her boots dragged with each step. When she reached the mill, she saw the wheel frozen stiff. The stream lay covered in a sheet of ice. The cabin beside it held a thin column of smoke from the chimney. Clara knocked on the door. The old man opened it with slow movements. His face looked pale. He held one hand against his back, strained from lifting wood. He said the night brought harsh wind through the roof gap. He said the cold slipped through the walls. Clara stepped inside. The old woman sat near the stove, wrapped in blankets. She smiled at Clara with tired eyes. Clara went to the stove and added fresh wood. She checked the roof and found a place where snow blew through a broken board. She stepped outside and climbed onto the small ledge. With careful movements, she pressed thick cloth into the gap and secured it. The wind slowed inside once she finished. She returned and steeped herbs in a pot of water. She handed the warm tea to the old couple. She asked about their food. The old man lowered his eyes and said, "They scraped the last of their dried beans last night." Clara placed 2 small bundles on the table. The old woman reached for them with trembling hands. Clara stayed until the cabin filled with more warmth. She assured the couple she would check on them again soon. She stepped outside once more. Snow fell in thick waves that blurred the far buildings. The wind howled across the road. Clara fought against it with slow steps. She moved toward the square to check the supply lines again. She feared the storm stopped deliveries. When she reached the square, she found a group of townsfolk gathered under the small roof near the store. Their faces looked tense. Mr. Norrin approached Clara and explained the wagon from the south stood trapped on the far road. The driver sent word through a messenger who reached town before dawn. Supplies might not arrive until the storm passed. Clara listened with a steady face. She asked what remained in storage. Mr. Norrin said the shelves grew thin. He showed her a small crate that held dried oats, 2 jars of molasses, and a few handfuls of lentils. Clara asked for a small portion of each and placed them in her satchel. She planned to stretch them as far as possible. As she turned to leave, she saw the father and boy at the edge of the square. They stood close to each other under torn blankets. Clara walked toward them. The father gave her a weary smile. The boy shivered beside him. Clara opened her satchel and handed them a cup of lentils and a small bundle of oats. She wrapped extra cloth around the boy's shoulders and told them to stay near the boarding house where the wind held less force. She left them and walked toward the blacksmith shop. The storm made each step slow. When she reached the shop, she knocked and heard the man's voice call from inside. She stepped in. The room felt warmer than yesterday. The blacksmith sat near the stove with a blanket over his knees. His face looked stronger, though he still held a slight tremor in his hands. Clara placed a jar of broth on the stove. She told him he needed more heat in the shop. She stacked wood inside his stove and waited until the flame rose. She stayed until he finished the broth. He thanked her with a rough voice. She promised to check on him again later. As she stepped back outside, the storm grew harsher. Snow whipped across her face. The streets felt empty. Doors stayed closed. Lamps glowed faintly behind frosted windows. Clara fought the wind as she made her way toward the forest cabin again. She knew the family there struggled in storms. She reached the path and pushed through the drifts. Branches sagged under the weight of snow. The cold pierced through her coat. She pressed on. When she reached the cabin, she knocked, and the mother opened the door with surprise. The children hurried forward. The father lifted his head from the cot. Clara placed the supplies on the table. She added more wood to the stove. She checked the man's leg and saw the swelling had lowered a little. She spoke in a calm tone that eased the mother's tension. She stayed until she heard the storm grow louder. She knew she had to return before darkness made the path too dangerous. She stepped outside and faced the wind. It pushed against her. Snow drifted across the path in thick sheets. Her steps grew heavier. The cold pressed deeper into her hands and cheeks. The storm roared around her. She moved with slow force through the woods, then across the field, then toward the first row of homes. When she reached the boarding house, she felt her legs shake. She stepped inside and shut the door quickly. Warm air touched her skin and spread across her face. She removed her coat and sat on the chair near the stove. She lit her small lamp and watched its gentle glow fill the room. She felt the weight of the day settle into her shoulders. Yet she also felt steady. The minister survived the night. The children read with bright eyes. The families held their small warmth. The old couple sat under a repaired roof. The blacksmith regained a bit of his strength. The father and boy stayed near shelter. Clara leaned back and breathed slow. The storm rattled the windows. The lamp's light moved across the walls. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the quiet fill her. Clara woke before sunrise. The storm still pressed against the walls, yet the wind carried a lower tone than yesterday. She rose from her cot and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. The boarding house felt colder than usual. Frost lined the edges of the window pane. The stove burned low. She added wood and waited until the fire rose. She warmed her hands above it until the ache eased outside. Pale blue light crept across the sky. The storm weakened, but snow piled high along the road. Drifts reached the tops of fences. Roofs sagged under the weight. Clara stepped out and shut the door behind her. The cold touched her face and spread down her neck. The air stood still before the next wind passed. The snow shifted with soft cracks under her boots. She started toward the minister's home. She took slow steps through the deep snow. She leaned her weight forward with each stride. The sky held a faint pink near the horizon. The day arrived clear yet bitter. When she reached the minister's home, she saw a stronger smoke trail rising from the chimney. She felt relief settle in her chest. She knocked with stiff fingers. The minister's wife opened the door with bright eyes. She said he slept through the night and spoke more words near dawn. His fever lowered again. Clara stepped inside and walked to his bedside. He looked at her with weak but clear eyes. Clara asked how he felt. He said his chest hurt less. His breath sounded deeper and steadier. She checked his pulse and nodded with calm approval. She gathered her herbs, prepared fresh tea, and handed it to him. He held the cup with trembling hands, but managed to drink more than yesterday. She sat beside him for a short time and listened to his slow breaths. The minister's wife asked if he would recover soon. Clara spoke in a steady voice and said he moved in the right direction. The woman placed a hand over her heart and thanked her. Clara stayed until he drifted back to sleep. She stepped outside again. The sky brightened to soft gold. Snow sparkled across the town in unbroken fields. She turned toward the ridge path to check on the children. She knew they waited for her each morning. The climb up the ridge forced her to stop once. Snow piled high against the slope. Her legs strained as she pushed through. Her breath formed thick clouds in the air. When she reached the top, she saw the cabin roof covered with a smooth layer of snow. Smoke curled from the chimney in steady lines. Clara knocked, and the door opened before she finished the second tap. The children grinned with wide smiles and waved her inside. The mother welcomed her with warm eyes. Clara stepped near the stove and rubbed her hands together. The room felt warm from the constant fire. The children showed her yesterday's pages and said they practiced, reading late into the evening. They sat across from her and waited for her to begin. Clara took her small booklet from her bag and read aloud while pointing at each word. The children followed with soft voices. Their progress grew stronger each day. They repeated lines with clear tone and steady rhythm. Clara taught them new words, then asked the older child to read a full paragraph. The mother smiled with pride as her daughter read without pause. The younger child practiced writing with a small pencil. He pressed each letter with care. Clara corrected his strokes with patience. She stayed until the light strengthened. The storm had left them enough wood to last through the morning. She stepped outside. The children waved again from the window. Clara walked toward the main road. She planned to reach the old couple near the mill. She knew the storm placed strain on their small cabin. She followed the narrow path that cut through open fields. Snow brushed against her knees at several points. Her steps sank deep. The cold tightened around her. She reached the mill and saw the frozen wheel covered in a thick coat of ice. The old couple's cabin still sent up a narrow line of smoke. She knocked. The old man opened the door slower than yesterday, but with more strength than before. He offered a faint smile. Inside, the old woman sat near the stove with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She greeted Clara with a soft voice. Clara checked the cloth she set in the roof gap yesterday. The wind no longer slipped through. The room felt warmer. She asked if they slept well. The old woman said they slept deeper than she expected. Clara brewed fresh tea and handed each of them a cup. She gave them a small portion of oats and told them to cook it later with a pinch of salt. The old man said it would last them 2 meals. Clara checked the stove and added more wood. Before she left, she asked if the cold troubled their joints. They said the ache grew stronger in the night, but faded with warmth. She stepped outside. The wind returned with new force. Loose snow drifted across the open field. She wrapped her shawl tighter and headed toward the square. She planned to see if the supply wagon moved yet. When she reached the square, she saw Mr. Norrin standing near the store door with a concerned look. He said the messenger returned with news that the wagon remained trapped behind a fallen tree. A team worked to clear the road, but progress moved slow. Clara asked if anyone found extra supplies in storage. He shook his head and said the last crate held only dried peas. Clara asked for a small cup of them. He handed them over with a heavy sigh. She thanked him and placed them inside her. Satchel. The father and boy from earlier sat under the awning again. Clara walked over. The boy shivered under the torn blanket. She handed them the dried peas and a small cloth bundle she saved from her personal store. The father's eyes softened with gratitude. He rested a hand on the boy's shoulder and told him to thank her. The boy whispered the words through chattering teeth. Clara reminded them to stay near the boarding house for warmth. She left them and headed toward the blacksmith's shop. Inside the shop, the blacksmith sat near the stove with a stronger look in his eyes. He lifted his hand in greeting. Clara prepared warm tea and checked his breathing. He said his chest hurt less today and the dizziness faded. She looked at his hands. The tremor weakened since yesterday. She told him he needed steady warmth. She placed more wood inside the stove. She wiped the frost from his window to let sunlight reach him. He thanked her again in a low, rough voice. Clara stepped outside. Snow cracked under her boots. She looked toward the forest path. She knew the family at the far cabin relied on her daily visits. She headed toward them with determined strides. The woods held a quiet calm after the storm. Thick snow weighed on the branches. The path remained difficult but passable. When she reached the cabin, she knocked, and the mother opened the door with relief. The father lay on the cot with a stronger color in his face. The children stood near him, speaking softly to lift his spirits. Clara placed her supplies on the table. She checked the man's leg. The swelling lowered even more. He said the pain eased during the night. Clara cleaned the wound and applied fresh herbs. She told him to rest until morning. She helped the mother melt snow for drinking water. She checked their wood supply. It held enough for one more night. She promised to bring more tomorrow if the roads cleared. As the afternoon light dimmed, Clara prepared to leave. The mother thanked her several times. The children hugged her, small arms tight around her waist. Clara stepped outside and watched them wave through the window. She made her way back through the woods. The cold strengthened as the day reached its end. The horizon darkened. Her breath grew heavier. The path felt longer on the return. Snow slipped under her boots. The wind brushed across the trees and carried soft creaks from the frozen branches. When she reached the town edge, she saw lamps burning in windows. She crossed the square. The father and boy rested under the awning. She stopped and handed them a small cup of hot broth she kept in her coat. The father bowed his head with gratitude. Clara returned to the boarding house. She stepped inside and shut the door before the wind followed. She placed her satchel on the floor and set her hands near the stove. The warmth spread across her fingers. She took a deep breath and sat in her chair. The room looked dim under the glow of her lamp. Snow pressed against the window pane. Clara felt the long day settle across her shoulders. She thought of the minister gaining strength. She thought of the children reading with pride. She thought of the old couple resting under a patched roof. She thought of the father and boy wrapped in extra cloth. She thought of the forest family holding warmth for another night. She let her eyes close for a short moment. The storm slowed outside. The lamp flickered with soft movement. She felt steady. The town drew strength from small acts and quiet efforts. Each home fought the cold in its own way. Clara rose before the first streak of light touched the sky. Her room held a deep cold that settled into the boards. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped toward the stove. The fire burned low. She added 2 small logs and waited for the flame to rise. The warmth spread slow through the room, enough to loosen the stiffness in her fingers. Outside, the storm weakened. The air held a soft calm, though the cold pressed harder than yesterday. Frost traced white lines along the edges of her window. Clara prepared her herbs and wrapped them in cloth. She filled her satchel with care, knowing she had a long route ahead. She touched the door before opening it and braced herself for the cold. She stepped outside into a wide stillness. Snow piled so high along the road it looked like new walls rose where fences once stood. Her boots sank with each step. Her breath formed pale clouds that drifted behind her. The sky brightened with a thin silver glow. She made her way to the minister's home first. When she reached the house, she saw the minister's wife sweep a small patch of snow off the steps. The woman looked up and smiled with tired yet hopeful eyes. She invited Clara inside. The air felt warmer compared to the morning outside. The minister sat propped against pillows with blankets pulled up to his chest. His face held more color than yesterday. Clara walked to his bedside. She checked his pulse, then placed her hand near his cheek. His fever remained low. He said he felt hungry for the first time in days. Clara prepared a small broth from herbs she brought. He drank it in slow sips. The minister's wife watched him with relief. She thanked Clara softly, her voice shaking with emotion. Clara stayed until he grew tired again. She stood from her chair and stepped outside. The cold embraced her with a sharp touch. She walked toward the ridge path, ready to visit the children. The snow reached nearly to her knees as she climbed. Her boots slipped once, but she regained balance and pushed forward. At the top of the ridge, she saw the familiar cabin. Smoke drifted from the chimney in steady ribbons. She knocked, and the door opened with quick excitement. The children called her name before the mother hushed them with a smile. Clara stepped inside. The warm room wrapped around her like a soft coat. The children brought their writing boards and pages. Clara checked their work from yesterday. The older child wrote clear lines with more confidence. The younger one traced letters with careful strokes. Clara praised both, then guided them through reading aloud. Their voices filled the small cabin with gentle sound. She taught them a new passage, then shared a short story from her booklet. The mother watched with pride, smoothing her daughter's hair as she spoke each word. Clara stayed until the cabin filled with bright morning light. Before she left, she handed the mother a small bundle of herbs to help with the lingering cough. She mentioned the day before Clara stepped back into the cold. She took a deep breath and began her walk toward the old couple near the mill. The snow felt heavier underfoot as she crossed the ridge and descended toward the frozen milling path. The wheel, once loud with turning water, looked still and stiff under thick ice. The cabin nearby stood half buried in drifts. She knocked. The old man opened the door, slower than before, but with steady posture. He invited her inside. The old woman sat close to the stove, with blankets around her shoulders. Clara checked the patched roof again. The cloth she placed still held strong. The drafts faded. The room felt warmer than her last visit. She handed them tea and checked their joints for swelling. The old woman said her knees hurt less this morning. The old man said he slept without waking from the cold. Clara prepared a small mixture of herbs for them to drink later. Before she left, she added wood to their stove. They thanked her with soft voices. Back outside, the cold bit at her cheeks. She made her way toward the center of town. A few people stepped outside their homes, clearing small paths to their doors. Clara waved to them as she passed. The air carried the sound of shovels scraping against snow, a sign of quiet recovery. She headed toward the store. Mr. Noren stood by the door with a worried look. He said the supply wagon made slight progress, but remained stuck behind a cluster of fallen branches. A team worked through the morning, but the road held deep snow and thick ice. Clara felt the weight of his words, but kept her voice steady. She asked if any crates remained. He shook his head. Only small portions of dried peas and salt sat on the shelves. Clara asked for a handful. He handed them to her and thanked her for helping the families through the storm. She walked toward the father and boy near the awning. The boy curled under the blanket but looked more alert today. The father nodded in greeting. Clara handed them the dried peas and a scrap of linen to help with the cold. The father thanked her and said the boy slept. Longer last night, Clara told them to stay near the boarding house again and walked toward the blacksmith's shop. Inside, the blacksmith sat closer to the stove with warmer cheeks. Clara checked his breathing. It sounded more open than yesterday. She gave him a fresh cup of tea. He told her the dizziness faded. She nodded and added more wood to the fire. She wiped frost from the window and let sunlight fall through the glass. The blacksmith said the warmth helped his hands. Clara left him with instructions for the afternoon. She set out toward the forest path for the last part of her route. Snow weighed heavy on the branches. The path grew narrow where the wind pushed drifts into tall ridges. She took her time, stepping with care, listening to the groan of distant trees under the strain of winter dot. When she reached the forest cabin, the children ran to the window. The mother opened the door with a wide smile. The father looked stronger, sitting upright on the cot with blankets around his legs. Clara checked his wound. The swelling dropped again. His breath sounded steady. He told her he slept for several long stretches without pain. Clara cleaned the wound and applied fresh herbs. She checked the children for signs of cold fatigue. Both looked bright with color in their cheeks. She told the mother the storm lost strength and the next day might bring clearer skies. The mother offered Clara a cup of warm broth. Clara accepted it and drank in slow sips. The warmth settled deep in her chest. She stayed until the father grew tired. Before leaving, she checked their woodpile. It reached low. She promised to return with more once the road cleared. As she stepped outside, the afternoon sky dimmed. Clouds drifted across the sun. A soft wind swept through the trees. Snow brushed against the tops of her boots. She walked through the forest with careful steps. Each branch above her creaked in the light breeze. By the time she reached the town's edge, lamps flickered in windows. The square held footprints again where people moved through the day. Clara walked toward the boarding house as the cold deepened. She saw the father and boys standing beside a small fire someone built near the awning. They waved to her. She gave a soft nod and continued home. Inside the boarding house, the warmth greeted her. She shut the door and leaned against it for a moment. The stove burned with steady flames. She placed her satchel on the table and unwrapped her shawl. Her hands throbbed with cold. She held them near the stove until the ache eased. Clara sat in her chair and let the silence wash over her. The day had been long, but each visit carried progress. The minister gained strength. The children advanced in their reading. The old couple felt less strain. The father and boy held more warmth than before. The Forrest family moved closer to recovery. She lifted her head and listened to the wind outside. It softened. The storm reached its end. A calm night hovered over the town. Clara woke before dawn again. The air in her room felt sharp and hollow. She pulled her shawl close and stepped toward the stove. The fire dropped low in the night. She fed it to small logs and waited until the flames rose and spread slow heat into the room. She rubbed her hands together until the stiffness faded. She checked her satchel and refilled the small pouches of herbs. She folded fresh cloth and tied it with twine. When she opened the door, the cold struck her cheeks with quick force. Outside, the storm finally loosened its grip. The sky held a soft grey that signaled a calmer day. Snow sat heavy on the rooftops, but no longer drifted through the air. The path that stretched through the town looked smoother, as if the storm pressed it into a firm sheet overnight. Clara breathed out slow and stepped forward. She crossed the square first. Mr. Narration swept the front of the store with slow movements. He lifted his head when he saw her. He said a rider entered town an hour earlier with news. The supply wagon reached a clearing near the lower ridge. Workers cut the fallen branches. Progress moved better than the day before. Clara felt a small rise of hope, but kept her voice steady. She asked if the rider brought anything with him. Mr. Narration said he carried 2 small sacks of flour, nothing more. Clara thanked him and continued her route. Her first stop was the minister's home. The minister's wife waited at the door before Clara reached the steps. She smiled with relief. Inside, the room felt warm, and the minister sat upright with his back against the pillows. His face looked stronger, and he greeted Clara with a small nod. She checked his pulse. It beat steady under her fingers. His breath no longer rasped. He said his appetite returned. She handed him a cup of warm broth and watched him finish it with more strength than yesterday. The minister's wife walked her to the door and told her the night passed without fear for the first time in several days. Clara nodded with quiet encouragement and stepped back into the cold. She turned toward the ridge path next, the snow packed firm under her boots. Even so, the climb felt slow. Each step pulled at her legs after long days of travel. She paused once to catch her breath, then pushed upward. The view opened at the top. The ridge stretched white and silent. The children's cabin sent out a straight line of smoke that rose into the pale morning dot. Clara knocked. The mother welcomed her with warm eyes. The children rushed to bring their pages. Clara checked their writing and praised their progress. The older child read a longer passage without stopping. The younger one shaped each letter with cleaner strokes. Clara taught them a short poem, each line simple and steady. The children repeated the words until the rhythm settled into their voices. She stayed until the sunlight filled the cabin. Before leaving, she handed the mother a small cloth of herbs to ease her cough through the night. The children hugged her legs and waved from the door as she stepped outside. The walk toward the mill took longer. The storm left deep ridges in the snow that slowed her progress. She reached the old couple's cabin and knocked. The old man opened the door with a careful smile. The old woman sat near the stove with a blanket around her shoulders. Clara checked the patched roof again. The cloth still blocked the wind. She touched the old woman's hands and found them warmer. She handed them fresh tea and checked their joints. The old man told her he walked across the room without losing balance this morning. Clara nodded with quiet approval. She added wood to their stove, then stepped outside. The cold bit at her fingertips again. She tucked her hands into her sleeves and walked toward the square. When she reached the store, she found the father and boy near the awning. They stood closer to a small barrel fire someone lit earlier. The boy held the worn blanket around his shoulders, but looked stronger than before. Clara handed them a small pouch of oats she saved from her own supply. The father thanked her and said the boy slept through the night. Clara told them to stay near the fire until the afternoon. She set off toward the blacksmith's shop. Inside, the blacksmith sat straighter in his chair. He greeted her with a rough voice that held more life than yesterday. Clara checked his breathing. It sounded clear. She gave him tea and placed more wood in his stove. He lifted his hands and showed her he could steady them without effort. Clara nodded with calm relief. She left the shop and turned toward the forest path. Snow sat thick along the narrow trail. Branches bowed low with the weight of ice. Clara stepped with caution, listening for signs of new breaks in the woods. When she reached the cabin, she knocked. The mother opened the door with a bright expression. The father sat upright near the stove, the blankets folded neatly at his sides. Clara checked his leg. The swelling lowered again. The wound held a clean look. He said he slept without pain. Clara cleaned the wound and applied fresh herbs. She checked the children for coughs or signs of cold fatigue. They stood close together with bright, alert faces. The mother offered her warm broth. Clara accepted and drank it with slow movements. The warmth settled through her hands and chest. She checked their wood pile. It sat low, but a small stack still remained. Clara promised to return with more once the road cleared further. As the afternoon arrived, Clara stepped outside. The wind softened. The clouds thinned until faint sunlight touched the snow. She followed the narrow path back toward the town. Each step felt heavy after days of travel, but her pace stayed steady. When she reached the town's edge, she saw people clearing more paths between homes. Children helped by lifting small shovels. Neighbors called to one another across the snow. Clara felt a quiet shift in the air. The storm's hold broke in the square. She saw Mr. Norrin speaking with two workers who carried ropes and axes. They said the wagon moved again and might reach the town by evening if the road through the lower woods stayed clear. Clara let out a slow breath. She walked toward the boarding house. The father and boy from the awning waved to her again. Clara stepped close and handed the boy a small slice of bread she kept wrapped in cloth. His eyes widened. He thanked her in a soft voice. Clara reminded them to stay warm. Inside the boarding house, the air felt warmer than usual. She shut the door and placed her satchel on the table. She removed her shawl and warmed her hands by the stove. She sat down in her chair and let the quiet settle. Her legs ached, but the ache carried a steady purpose. She thought of the minister gaining strength. She thought of the children with their reading. She thought of the old couple resting in warmth. She thought of the blacksmith recovering. She thought of the Forrest family preparing for the next day. The storm weakened. The town's strength returned. The long freeze shifted toward calmer hours. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a short moment. The stove crackled. Snow pressed lightly against the window. The night approached with slow steps. Clara woke in the darkest hour of morning, when the sky held no color and the fire dropped low in the stove. She sat up slow. Her legs felt tight from the long days of walking. She stretched her calves, rubbed her hands, and reached for the kettle. She warmed a small cup of broth and drank it while the cabin settled into stillness. Outside, no wind touched the walls. The storm left, yet the cold stayed strong. She stepped outside and breathed in deep. The air struck her throat with sharp chill. Snow covered each rooftop, each fence post, each frozen rail of the well. She walked toward the square and watched as faint morning light rose in thin lines behind the hills. The calm brought a different silence. Not the heavy silence of a storm, but a waiting silence. Mr. Norrin stood at the steps of his store again, though this time he swept with more purpose. He looked toward the ridge and said the wagon crew finished the last stretch. He expected the wagon by late morning if the horses held steady. Clara thanked him and continued her steps. She planned her route for the day. She would check the minister first, then the siblings near the ridge, then the old couple, then the townspeople near the square. She hoped she could lighten her satchel. By midday, once the wagon arrived with supplies, she started with the minister. The minister's wife opened the door with warm eyes. She stepped aside and let Clara enter. The room felt warm. The minister sat upright at the small table for the first time since his fever rose. He wore a thick shawl and held a book in his hands. He greeted Clara with a soft smile. His cheeks carried faint color instead of the pale look he held days. Before Clara checked his temperature, it felt normal. She checked his pulse. It felt steady. The minister thanked her for the herbs and said he slept through the night without pain or chills. His wife prepared warm broth, and Clara nodded when she saw him finish the cup without struggle. Clara reminded them to keep the room warm. Then she stepped back into the cold. Her route toward the ridge path felt lighter than yesterday, though the climb still pressed at her legs. The packed snow held firm, and her boots gripped well. When she reached the children's cabin, their mother waited at the door. The children held their pages with pride. They stood straight beside the table and showed her their new writing. Clara checked the letters and praised their careful strokes. She taught them small sums and had them read another line. The older child read with smoother voice. The younger one held steady without fear of slipping over a word. Clara stayed until she heard the father's footsteps outside as he returned from checking traps. He brushed snow from his shoulders and thanked her again for helping them through the long storm. Clara left the cabin after placing one more bundle of herbs on the shelf for the mother's cough. The path toward the old couple's cabin stretched. Quiet. No wind touched the branches. Snow rested on the limbs in a soft line. She walked slow to spare her legs, and the stillness made each step sound loud in the clean morning air. The old man opened the door before she knocked. He leaned on his cane, yet stood straighter. The old woman sat near the stove again, though with stronger posture. Clara checked their supplies. The broth she prepared earlier still lasted. The firewood looked low, though enough for the day. Clara checked their joints. The swelling in the old woman's fingers lowered. The old man's breathing felt less strained. Clara poured warm tea and placed another log in their stove. When she stepped outside, the light rose higher. She walked toward the square again, and this time she saw more movement outside. Children stood near the town well, scraping away ice around the ropes. A man with broad shoulders swept the walkway in front of the meeting hall. The air felt different. The town began to rise again. Clara reached the boarding house and found the father and boy by the small barrel fire once more. The boy looked stronger. Each day, his face carried more color, and his hands no longer shook from cold. Clara knelt and checked his breath. It flowed smooth. She handed him a small pouch of oats she saved from her own supply. His father thanked her with quiet words. Clara turned towards the blacksmith's shop. When she entered, the blacksmith sat with a fresh blanket over his shoulders. He lifted his hands and showed her he could steady them without effort. She checked. His pulse had beat strong. She checked his breathing. It sounded clear. He said he hoped to stand tomorrow. She told him to wait one more day, and he nodded with calm acceptance. Her final stop took her toward the distant cabin in the forest. The path felt longer today, though not because of weather. She stopped twice to stretch her legs. The cold settled in her joints after long days of walking. But she pushed forward. When she reached the cabin, the mother greeted her with a broad smile. The father sat up near the stove with his leg wrapped in clean cloth. Clara knelt to inspect the healing. The swelling lowered again. The wound looked strong. She replaced the cloth with new herbs. The children stood behind her and watched with wide, hopeful eyes. The mother asked if the wagon reached town yet. Clara said it should arrive before noon. The mother sighed with relief. She checked the small shelves for flour. Only a handful remained. Clara promised to bring them more supplies as soon as the wagon reached the square. She stepped outside again. The frost on the cabin window glimmered in the rising light. She walked toward the town with slow steps. Halfway down the path, she heard something faint behind her. A distant crack. Not the sharp sound of a branch snapping. Something deeper. She paused and turned. She scanned the ridge, then the trees. Nothing moved. The silence felt deeper than before. She started walking again, though something in her chest tightened. When she reached the edge of town, she saw the first sign of new life. A rider crossed the square from the west road. Snow lifted behind the horse's hooves as he pulled the reins and slowed near the well. People stepped out of their homes. They walked toward him in small groups. Clara approached. The rider dismounted and brushed snow from his shoulders. He said the wagon moved through the last clearing and now waited just beyond the bend. Workers worked through the night to move branches and ice. They covered the supplies with a heavy tarp. Clara felt the tension in her chest ease. She thanked him and headed toward the road. The square shifted with movement. People gathered near the entrance of the town. The sound of horses reached them. 2 large horses pulled the wagon through the final stretch of the road. The wheels crushed the packed snow with steady rhythm. The tarp-covered supplies sat high. Flour sacks, blankets, dried beans, and small crates filled with basic goods. As the wagon entered the square, the townspeople sighed and lifted their shoulders in relief. Clara watched from the side with quiet gratitude. She felt her legs weaken a little from the long days of work, yet her spirit held strong. The wagon stopped near the store. Workers untied the ropes and lifted the canvas. Mr. Norrin stepped forward. With a list in his hand, people lined up. None pushed or hurried. They stood steady, thankful for the sight before them. Clara stood back until the crowd thinned. When she approached, Mr. Norrin set aside a small crate marked with her name. Inside, she found Herb's cloth, small rations, and a note from the supply coordinator who knew her work. Clara placed the crate in her satchel and thanked him. She traveled again toward her rounds. She carried flour and herbs to the old couple. She brought oats to the father and boy at the boarding house. She carried wood and cloth for the minister and his wife. She saved the largest portion for the family in the forest. By afternoon, the sun reached a low angle above the hills. Clara walked toward the forest path again, though slower. Her legs shook with fatigue, but she pressed forward. When she reached the cavern and handed the family the supplies, the mother's hands shook with gratitude. The father nodded with slow relief. The children stared at the flower with wide smiles. Clara stayed until the fire grew stronger. When she stepped outside, the world felt warmer, though the air still cut sharp and cold. She walked towards town. One last time. The sky held a pale gold glow. The snow glimmered across the hills. Clara reached her small cabin and shut the door behind her. She rested her satchel on the table, lit a small lamp, and sat in her chair. Her hands shook from exhaustion, but her heart felt steady. The storm passed. Supplies returned. The town eased into calm again. Clara woke before first light again. Her body asked for rest, yet she lifted herself from the cot and sat upright. The room felt cold. Frost crept along the window panes in thin white lines. The stove held only faint embers. She added 2 small logs and breathed on the coals until the flames caught. Her hands warmed slow, and when the fire grew steady, she wrapped her scarf around her neck. She knew the storm passed. She knew the supplies arrived. Yet she sensed the town still stood on thin ground. People needed warmth. People needed comfort. People needed assurance after so many weeks of fear. She stepped outside with quiet steps. The early morning sky held a soft blue glow. Snow rested smooth across the roofs and fences. A thin fog rose from the wooded edge of town. Clara paused and listened. A faint hum drifted from the smith's chimney. Someone tossed wood onto a fire near the inn. A dog barked once from down the road. Life moved again. She walked toward the store first. Mr. Norrin already stood outside with a small ledger. He greeted her with a slow nod. He said people worked late into the night sorting sacks and crates. He planned to organize more deliveries today for anyone unable to reach the square. Clara thanked him and asked for a few extra blankets for the old couple. He handed them to her without hesitation. She tucked them under her arm and stepped away. Her first stop sat at the small house near the riverbank. A young mother lived there with her toddler. Their home stayed steady through the storm, but food stayed scarce. When Clara knocked, the mother opened the door with a tired face. Clara handed her 2 small bags of flour and a bundle of dried beans. The mother's shoulders dropped with relief. She thanked Clara and invited her inside. Clara stepped in. The toddler sat on the floor near the stove, piling small wooden blocks in uneven stacks. Clara knelt beside him and helped him form a steady tower. The mother stirred a pot on the stove. The warm steam rose through the room. Clara stayed long enough to check the mother's breath and the child's temperature. Both seemed healthy. She stepped back outside with the blankets still under her arm. Her next stop sat on the south ridge. The climb pulled at her legs again, yet the snow felt firmer today. She followed the narrow trail through a cluster of bare trees. At the top, the minister's home appeared through the branches. When she reached the door, the minister's wife greeted her with a soft smile. She stepped inside and saw the minister, sitting at the table with a quill in his hand. He wrote slow but steady. His recovery surprised her. Only days earlier he could not lift his head without shaking. Now he sat upright with warmth in his cheeks. Clara checked his pulse again. Strong. She touched his forehead. Clear. She checked his lungs and listened for tightness. None remained. She handed his wife a small pouch of herbs to strengthen his sleep. She reminded them to keep the room warm. They thanked her, and Clara stepped back into the cold. She continued to the siblings near the ridge. When she reached their door, the mother waved her inside. The children stood at the table again with their books open and pencils ready. Clara sat with them for a full lesson this time. She guided their reading, corrected their sums, and praised every careful step. She wanted them to feel progress again after so many days lost to fear and cold. The father entered mid-lesson with a small bundle of firewood. He nodded with gratitude when he saw Clara. She promised to return with more supplies before dusk. She had more names to visit before then. Her path toward the old couple stretched quiet. The ridge sat low behind her, and the sky grew brighter. When she reached their cabin, she stepped inside without knocking. The old woman sat near the stove, with a blanket over her lap. The old man sat at the table with a cup of warm tea. When he saw Clara, he straightened in his chair. Clara handed them the blankets. She wrapped one around the old woman's shoulders and draped the other across the old man's chair. She checked their joints again and found less swelling. She checked their lungs again and heard more strength in their breath. She warmed broth on the stove and stayed long enough to make sure the old woman finished her cup without strain. When she left their cabin, she felt the relief of their progress, but also the weight of her next task. She planned to check on the new family who arrived in town the day before the storm. They lived in a small cabin near the frozen creek. She had not yet reached them since the storm lifted. The walk took her down a narrow path. Trees lined the burr. Sides, branches bowed under the weight of snow. When she reached the cabin, she knocked twice. No answer. She knocked again. After a long pause, she heard slow footsteps. The door opened to reveal a man in his 40s with sunken cheeks and tired eyes. Clara introduced herself. He nodded and opened the door wider. Inside, a woman sat on the floor with 2 children beside her. The room felt cold. The stove held only weak embers. Clara stepped inside and reached for her satchel. She handed the woman a bundle of wood, a small bag of flour and herbs. The woman took them with shaking hands. Clara moved to the stove and placed 2 logs inside. She knelt and fanned the embers until the flames grew. The children sat close to the warmth. Clara checked their hands and cheeks, red with cold, yet no fever. She asked if the family had food. The man shook his head. Clara opened her satchel and handed them a small bag of oats she saved. She told them the wagon arrived with supplies. She would return in a few hours with more blankets and beans. The man's voice cracked as he thanked her. Clara stepped outside again with slow steps. The cold touched her face, yet her thoughts stayed warm. The family needed more than she carried, and she planned her return route as she walked toward town. The day reached its highest light as she approached the square. Workers formed lines outside the store. People carried sacks on their shoulders and crates in their arms. Clara stepped inside, found Mr. Noren, and told him about the new family. He wrote their name on his ledger and gathered 2 small blankets, a sack of beans, flour, and cloth. Clara lifted the supplies into her satchel. She checked her list. She still needed to check the boarding house father and son, the blacksmith, the remote family in the forest, and the couple who lived near the northern edge of town. The day felt long already, yet her steps stayed steady. Her next stop took her to the boarding house. The boy and father waited near the same barrel fire. The boy stood without trembling. His father watched him with soft pride. Clara checked the boy's pulse and breath. Both sounded strong. She handed them a small bundle of beans and a scrap of cloth for the boy's coat. The father bowed his head with thanks. She travelled next to the blacksmith. When she entered, he stood by the workbench, his posture stiff, yet upright. He placed his hands on the table to show her his strength. Clara checked his breathing again, steady. She reminded him not to work until tomorrow. He nodded, though she saw the hunger for work in his eyes. She stepped outside and started the long walk toward the forest family. The trail dipped and rose through frost-covered trees. The air held a soft hum in the distance. By the time she reached the cabin, smoke rose from the chimney. She knocked. The mother opened the door with warmth in her eyes. The father sat closer to the stove than before, with his injured leg propped on a stool. Clara handed them flour, beans, and cloth. The mother's gratitude shone stronger than words. Clara checked the father's wound again, healing well. She wrapped new herbs and reminded him to rest. She stayed until the fire rose high again. When she stepped out for the last time that day, the sky shifted toward dusk. Pale orange touched the tops of the trees. Her steps slowed. Fatigue wrapped around her legs. She walked toward town with careful pace. At the edge of town, she stopped. Snow glimmered under the final light of day. Smoke rose from chimneys. Warm. Windows glowed. Clara breathed deep. The town lived again, not strong yet, but rising. She walked toward her cabin. Her legs shook. Her hands throbbed. She pushed open her door, set her satchel down, and sat on her cot. The fire crackled. Her body softened into the warmth. She closed her eyes and let the long days settle inside her. Clara woke before dawn again, though her eyes stayed slow to open. Her body pressed into the thin mattress as if it wanted more time, yet she pushed herself upright. The fire burned low. She fed it to small logs and watched until the flames spread across the bark. Her shoulders ached, her legs ached, her hands ached. She stretched each finger until the joints loosened. When she stood, she wrapped her scarf around her neck and stepped into the morning cold. Snow drifted in light flakes from a pale sky. The air tasted softer today. Clara paused on her steps and looked down the road. People moved early. 2 men carried a crate toward the inn. A woman swept snow from her porch. A few children stepped outside to gather twigs for their stoves. These signs of motion filled Clara with quiet strength. She planned her route for the day. She needed to check several homes she had not reached since the worst of the storm. Some lay near the hills. One family lived near the northern fence, where wind struck hardest. She also needed to return to the new family near the frozen creek. She carried supplies for them inside her satchel. Her first stop sat only a short walk away. A widow lived there, alone, in a narrow house with a steep roof. Clara knocked twice. The door opened with a creak. The widow stood with a blanket over her shoulders and a cup of weak tea in her hand. Clara stepped inside and set down her satchel. The house smelled of pine. The widow's thin hands shook as she lifted the cup. Clara checked her pulse and lungs. The breath held steady, though weak. Clara offered her dried herbs and a small bag of beans. The widow thanked her and sat near the stove. Clara placed one more log inside for extra heat. Before she left, she promised to return in 2 days. Her next stop sat down a narrow road lined with fences, blanketed with snow. Clara visited a family with 3 children. When she reached the house, she heard small voices inside. A boy opened the door. His face brightened when he saw her. Inside, the mother stood near the stove, stirring porridge. The father sat at the table sharpening an old knife. Clara joined the children near the warmth. She checked each child's breath and listened to their heartbeat. All healthy. The father thanked her for checking their home, and the mother handed Clara a small wooden spoon carved by the eldest child. Clara accepted it with warmth in her chest. She left the house with a lighter heart and moved toward the northern edge of town. The wind picked up, pushing snow across the road. Clara pulled her scarf over her mouth and continued that. Near the fence stood where the valley dipped slightly. The roof held a thick layer of snow. Smoke rose from the chimney in thin threads. Clara knocked. A man opened the door with tired eyes. His wife sat near the stove holding their newborn child. Clara stepped inside and moved with great care. The mother looked weak, her face pale. Clara knelt beside her and checked her pulse. Slow. She asked the father for warm water. He brought it in a tin cup. Clara mixed herbs and handed it to the mother. She drank in small sips. Clara checked the newborn. Small hands, tight fists, warm breath. The child slept in a cloth wrap. She instructed the father to add wood to the fire often, even through the night. She gave him extra herbs for the mother. Before she left, she filled his hands with beans and a small scrap of wool she saved. His voice broke when he thanked her. Clara stepped back into the wind. Snow brushed her face. Her steps slowed with fatigue, yet she pushed forward. She knew her next stop mattered. The new family near the frozen creek waited for her return. She followed a narrow trail through a cluster of bare trees. Ice cracked faintly under the creek's surface. When she reached the cabin, she saw smoke rising stronger than yesterday. She knocked. The man opened the door with a grateful expression. Inside, the woman sat near the stove with the children on either side. Their cheeks held more color. Their hands stayed warm. Clara set the new supplies on the table. The woman touched each, eyed them with quiet relief. Clara checked the stove. Flames burned bright. She checked the children again. Their breath felt steady. She stayed long enough to help prepare a small pot of porridge. Before she left, the man placed his hand on her shoulder. His gratitude needed no words. She stepped outside and breathed in the cold. The sky lifted slightly, and pale sunlight broke through thin clouds. She walked toward town again with careful steps. Her legs felt heavy. Her breath grew slow. Yet she continued. When she reached the main road, she saw Mr. Narration near the entrance of the store. He waved her over. He told her the wagon driver wanted to speak with her. Clara followed him inside. The driver stood near the counter, with frost still clinging to his boots. He explained that another supply wagon rested 3 days away. If the weather stayed steady, it would arrive soon. Clara nodded. Relief swept over her. More food, more cloth, more wood. Enough to keep the town steady through the coming weeks. She thanked the driver and stepped back outside. She still had 2 more homes to visit before dusk. Her next stop sat near the edge of the woods. A young couple lived there. The wife suffered from lung trouble each winter. Clara hurried her pace despite her tired body. When she reached the cabin, she knocked and waited. The husband opened the door with worry in his eyes. The wife sat in a chair near the stove, wrapped in a thick coat. Her breaths came shallow. Clara knelt beside her and pressed her ear to her chest. She heard tightness. She took herbs from her satchel and placed them in a small cup with hot water. The wife drank slowly. Clara stayed long. She waited until the woman's breathing loosened. She placed extra wood near the stove. She handed the husband a small cloth pouch with instructions. She promised to return each morning for the next 3 days. When she stepped outside, dusk approached. The sky darkened. Thin flakes fell again. Clara felt the weight of the day settle across her shoulders. Her final visit lay on the opposite side of the ridge. A man lived alone in a small cabin with no family near. Clara followed the narrow trail through the dark. She reached his cabin and knocked. The door opened with a slow creak. The man had a thick beard and tired eyes. Clara checked his pulse and breath. He held a mild fever. She mixed herbs in warm water and waited while he drank. She added wood too. His stove prepared a simple broth and gave him extra beans and flour. He nodded with slow gratitude. Night deepened when Clara left. She walked toward town with slow steps. The snow whispered under her boots. No wind, only silence. When she reached her cabin, she pushed open the door. The warmth washed over her. She set her satchel down and sat on the edge of her cot. Her body felt heavy, yet her heart felt steady. The town lived. Families warmed. Children played. Fires burned bright. Supplies stretched. And she would rise again tomorrow to do the same. Work. She leaned back, closed her eyes and let the soft sounds of the fire fill the room. Dawn rose behind a veil of pale blue light. Clara woke with slow breaths, her body weighed down by the long days behind her. She sat on the edge of her cot and pressed her hands together until her fingers warmed. The fire burned low from the night, so she added 2 logs and watched them catch. The room filled with a steady glow. She wrapped her coat around her shoulders and tightened the scarf around her neck. She stepped outside into still air. No wind, no sharp sting, only a soft cold that felt almost gentle after the harsh days before. The town lay quiet. Smoke lifted from chimneys in straight lines. A few lanterns glimmered behind windows. The freeze had not lifted, but the sharp edge had dulled. Clara walked toward the main road with slow steps. Each step sank into the snow with a muted sound. She stopped at the store first. Mr. Narration stood behind the counter stacking small bundles of dried herbs. When he saw her, he set them aside and told her the driver had sent new word. The second wagon moved closer. It reached the last ridge, slowed by snow, but still moving. If the weather stayed steady, it would reach town before nightfall. Clara thanked him. The thought of more supplies steadied her heart. She left the store and walked toward the widow's house for her first visit. Snow lined the path. The roof glistened under dawn light. She knocked and waited. The widow opened the door slowly. Her face held more color today. Her hands shook less. Clara stepped inside and checked her breath and pulse, both strong enough. For now, she warmed water on the stove and filled the widow's cup. They spoke in quiet tones about the night and the cold. Before she left, Clara placed another log on the fire and promised to return soon. Her next stop took her to the house with 3 children. She followed the worn path until she reached the front steps. The door opened before she knocked. The children stood bundled in coats, ready to greet her. Their cheeks glowed with warmth from the stove. Their mother invited her in. Clara checked each child with careful hands. All healthy. She took a small spoonful of porridge to taste its warmth. The father stood near the table and thanked her again for checking on them throughout the long freeze. Clara smiled and stepped back outside. The northern fence lay ahead. Clara walked through crisp air. Snow crunched under her boots. When she reached the house, she knocked once. The father opened the door with a tired smile. Inside, the mother rested on a cot near the fire with the newborn in her arms. Clara knelt to check them both. The mother's breath held steady. Her cheeks had gained slight color. The newborn shifted and stretched tiny fingers. Clara placed more herbs on the table and instructed the father to boil water twice more through the day. She stayed until the mother's eyes brightened a bit, then stepped outside again. She headed toward the creek, where the new family waited. The trail wound through trees heavy with snow. When she reached the cabin, the man opened the door quickly. The woman sat near the stove while the children played with sticks they arranged in small shapes on the floor. Clara checked them all. Better, stronger. The air in the room felt warmer than yesterday. She helped stir a small pot hanging over the fire. Before she left, the man pressed a tiny carved button into her hand, a gesture of thanks. Clara walked back toward town, but she paused when she reached the ridge. From there, she saw movement on the far road. She stepped closer to the edge of the hill and squinted into the distance. A wagon. The second supply wagon. It crawled along the road with steady wheels, pulled by 2 horses. The driver sat hunched forward, guiding them through packed snow. Clara's breath caught in her chest. Relief washed through her. She hurried down the ridge and crossed the path to meet them. When she reached the wagon, the driver waved in greeting. His beard held a thin layer of frost. He said he left before dawn and pushed through a deep patch of snow near the southern bend, but the horses pulled through. He stepped down from the wagon and stretched stiff legs. Clara walked around to the back. She saw sacks of beans, flour, dried herbs, small bundles of cloth, rope, medicine bottles, candles, and 3 crates of dried apples. She helped the driver carry the crates to the store while townspeople gathered to assist. Children watched with wide eyes. Parents lifted heavy sacks. Men from the harbour came to help unload. Clara carried bundles of herbs and cloth to the counter. Inside, Mr. Norrin set each group in neat rows. People breathed easier. With the wagon unloaded, Clara returned to her rounds. She visited the young couple near the woods next. The husband opened the door with relief. His wife sat near the fire with warmer cheeks. Clara checked her breath. Looser today. She gave them a small sack of new supplies from the wagon. They thanked her in soft voices. She left the cabin and moved toward the final home of the Datha man who lived alone near the ridge. When she arrived, she knocked and waited. He opened the door slowly, leaning on the frame. His fever had dropped. His eyes looked clearer. Clara checked his forehead, pulse, and hands. All signs pointed towards steady improvement. She placed new herbs on his table and warmed broth on his stove. She stayed long enough to see strength return to his voice. When she stepped outside, the sky shifted toward dusk. She walked toward town with relaxed steps. Smoke filled the air from many chimneys. Doors stood open as neighbors talked. Children rolled snow into small piles near the road. The town breathed again. Clara reached her cabin and stepped inside. She set her satchel down and removed her coat. The fire burned bright. She sat on her cot and let her shoulders fall. Her work reached an end for now. The freeze still held the land, but the danger had eased. Supplies filled homes again. Fires stayed strong through the night. Illness lessened. New hope spread across town. Clara leaned back on the cot with slow breaths. She listened to the fire. She felt warmth spread through her hands. She closed her eyes and let the quiet settle over her. The winter held its grip, but its weight no longer pressed as hard. She knew the freeze would pass. And when spring reached the valley, the schoolhouse doors would open again. Children would return with bright faces and warm coats. She would stand at the front of the room, chalk in hand, and guide them through long mornings once more. For now, she rested in a rare moment of peace. The long winter of 1879 shaped every corner of the town, and Clara had walked its frozen paths each day, bringing strength where the cold tried to take it. Thank you for staying through this long winter night. Let your breath slow now. Let your shoulders soften. The cold season in Clara's town settles. Behind you, quiet and still, the fires in each home glow steady. The people rest. The snow holds a calm silence across the valley. You shared their steps, their long hours, their small moments of hope. Now you rest with them, I will bring another gentle winter story soon, with new faces from the past and new quiet paths to follow in the dark. Before you drift off, I left a small gift for you in the description. It holds soft lines meant to ease you into sleep. Pull your blanket closer. Close your eyes at your own pace. Let the room grow softer. Let the night settle around you. I am glad you spent this time here. Sleep waits for you.